right, we've heard the word. So just wanted to wish everyone a really warm welcome to the Gilbrea seminar series. And I'd like to begin our time together by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster University stands. To say this is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us, and also to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have to this land. So thank you so much to everyone for attending our third seminar of the 2025-2026 Gilbrea Annual Seminar Series. My name is Nicole Dalmer. I'm the Acting Director of the Gilbrea Center for Studies in Aging. This year, we have been focused on climate gerontology. And in doing so, we've been looking at the many different ways climate change impacts older adults and how older adults contribute to climate action and activisms. And today we're so excited to have Dr. Gary Hack joining us virtually to present a seminar titled, quite fittingly, Climate Gerontology, Rethinking Aging in a Changing Climate. For the seminar, we'll just ask that you keep yourself on mute during the actual presentation just to avoid that background noise. Dr. Hack will present for about 45 minutes, and he's indicated he's open to kind of some lively discussion. And so we'll have about 25 minutes, 20, excuse me, to 15 minutes for question and answer. For the question and answer period, please feel free, if it's a more comfortable way, you can type your question into the chat box and I can read that aloud for you. Or you can unmute yourself to ask Gary directly. And just a few words about Dr. Hack before I turn the floor over to him. Dr. Gary Hack is a senior research associate in the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York in the UK. His work focuses on the intersection of aging and climate change, helping to shape the emerging field of climate gerontology. And indeed, he's one of the kind of early kind of inventors of this term. He examines how older people are affected by climate impacts and how they can contribute to resilience, adaptation, and climate action. He has led international dialogues in Africa, Asia, and Europe to highlight the experiences and contributions of older people in global climate debates. His research seeks to ensure aging is recognized as a key dimension of climate justice and that climate policies are inclusive, fair, and effective across generations. Thank you so very much, Gary, for joining us today. And I'll ask folks to join me in welcoming Dr. Hack to our seminar series. Thank you. And the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. What I would like to do in this short time we have together is to present a case really for climate gerontology. So I've never done this presentation before. It's more about thinking that I've been developing in collaboration with a colleague, Gloria Gutman at Simon Fraser University. And it's really calling for a new interdisciplinary field of climate gerontology. So what I'm going to present is not necessarily the definitive kind of definition, but I'm happy for you all to share your views and to collaborate with me into really working out what this field could and should be. So I'll start by just sharing my presentation. I hope you can all see that now. Yes.
Looks great, Gary.
Great. So as has been said, my name is Gary Hack. I'm a senior researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York in the UK. Now, you might want to know why Stockholm Environment Institute UK. Just to say, the Stockholm Environment Institute is an international environment and development institute. We have our headquarters in Stockholm and we have offices around the world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and North America. And we're really looking at our mission is to support decision making and bridging the gap between science and policy. My background is a human ecologist, so I'm interested in looking at how humans interact with their natural environment, social, economic environment. And as part of that, I've done many different research in different areas. But one research that I started back in 2008, can you believe, is looking at this intersection between aging and climate change. Then the first project was in 2007, looking at how we can engage older people over 50s in climate change to raise awareness. And then that led me to think about the potential impact climate change has on older people. In 2008, we did our first in the UK uh, webinar workshop, if you like, workshop on growing old in a changing climate. But since then, we've been looking at this intersection between aging and climate, looking at engagement, looking at climate change on the global level, trying to define climate gerontology, and more recently, looking at healthy aging and climate change in the UK. Last year, I did these global webinars in Africa, Asia, Latin America, in collaboration with Help Age International, looking at aging and climate in the different regions. And more recently, one project which I am doing now in Scotland is called Climate Wisdom, looking at dementia-friendly climate action. So what's interesting for me, back in 2007, 2008, when I started to talk about aging and climate change, nobody was interested. What's great to see is that over these years, more and more people are registering that, climate change has an impact on older people, but older people can also make a contribution to climate action. And there's more research coming out, more papers, and the evidence base is increasing. And we're getting to understand this intersection better, but more work needs to be done. So I'll now present, if you like, the case for climate gerontology, and you can hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards. As you probably all know, we have an aging climate. I'm taking here a global perspective. So we look at the state of the pace of aging globally, and it's often we know that many high-income countries they they contribute more to greenhouse gas emissions, but those low-income countries such as Africa are being more affected by climate change. So although they have a low historical responsibility for emissions per capita, they're actually more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But also, for example, like in Asia, this is where the greatest growth in older people will be taking place. So it's really understanding that we have an aging population. At the same time, we have a changing climate, and we know how the climate is affecting everyday weather, storms, hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves, all impacting not just older people, but everyone and our way of life. And the frequency and magnitude of the climate impact is increasing. I just want to give you an example here of extreme weather events, and this is for last year. I don't know if you can see that we've had record-breaking heat waves in Japan, Australia, severe floods in Italy, and storms also around the world displacing older people. And there you can see heat waves is the number one, followed by rain and wet spells and flooding. So heat, flooding, tropical cyclones. These are the kind of impacts or the changes that the climate is having and impacting all of us, but impacting vulnerable groups more so. So when we talk about this intersection of older people, climate change, what are we actually talking about? So if here is a nice way to present it. We have the climate hazard, we have the exposure, and we have the susceptibility. So climate hazard is, like I said, heat waves, intense storms, rising sea levels, changing precipitation patterns, droughts, flooding, wildfires. This is happening, and people are exposed to heat, greater vulnerability when it comes to risk of natural disasters, hurricanes, and floods, and and also increasing incidence of hypothermia for some people. But then all this is combined to susceptibility, your exposure, the actual climate hazard, and then the impact it has on different groups. But as older adults, we're talking about a group that may be having declining health or limited mobility, may have limited access to healthcare and income, and other age-related challenges. And this becomes an issue for if we want it for emergency evacuation, for taking care of maybe older people. If there's an example that I give, imagine that you're at home, you have care at home, but then it's flooding and your carer cannot reach you because of that, or you lose the electricity supply, and maybe you're dependent on the electricity for some kind of medical intervention. So it's climate hazards, exposure, and susceptibility. And this will change depending on the environment and the context and the country. So, for example, if you think of Africa, it'll be a totally different kind of experience of what the maybe the susceptibility is compared to, say, a high income country like Canada. So, but it's this ultimately it's this combination, intersection of climate change, exposure, susceptibility that determines whether one individual is able to cope with this change or not. And then we could think broader about this intersection of how it impacts on the human rights of older people when it comes, and this is all aspects. So, how climate impacts water and sanitation, and that kind of insecurity, especially in a low income country, cultural conditions, how climate change affects these traditions and heritage sites, social protection, the frequency of disasters and extreme weather events, and how this impacts care, work and livelihoods, food, housing, mobility, life, safety, and health. So it impacts all of us in all aspects of our lives in different ways. And as I said, the the extent it impacts one group or another group is really dependent on the environment where they live and the access they have to, for example, emergency services or health services. So it's really understanding this in a very holistic way, and that's why I think this idea of studying this in an interdisciplinary way matters. As I said, climate change is already shaping later life's experience worldwide. But at the same time, we know that even though there's growing evidence, especially since 2007, the issue of climate change and older people is very marginal, especially in mainstream gerontology, and it's often treated as an external risk rather than kind of some global structural condition that's affecting us. So this is why this study of climate gerontology, in my mind, matters. You may disagree, but we can have a discussion later. And so far, just to say, I'm not a gerontologist. This is what I'm learning as an interdisciplinary researcher. Some of you may have stronger opinions or have a different opinion. But from my understanding as a interdisciplinary researcher coming to this area of gerontology and environment, is that so far, when we look at gerontology, it's very good at looking at the determinants of health and vulnerability, looking at place, housing, neighborhoods, age-friendly design, how the person and environment fit in later life. It does that well. But what's missing is looking at the climate crisis as a structural condition affecting the whole life course, how we can integrate this aspect of mitigation, reducing our emissions to greenhouse gas emissions, adapting to a changing climate, and building that resilience in later life, but also doing it in a way that is inclusive, participatory, and that puts older people at the center of that kind of policy process and research when it comes to climate and aging. So that was the conceptual gap. If we look at the kind of historical development, we know we can go back to human ecology, looking at aging and place as a socio-ecological experience, moving on to like the behavior and then this concept of environment press, how the environment can affect an individual and whether the individual is able to fits correctly to that environment. But then there's been a call for more interdisciplinary field building, looking at psychology and geography, and then moving on to this kind of more broader climate crisis. So there is a kind of already a development from environmental gerontology to what we are doing today is looking at not just looking at place-based kind of interaction of older people and their environment, but looking at environment as a global phenomenon that's affecting all aspects of life. And so, why this is my case? Why is a new field needed? We have an aging population, we have a changing climate, and we need to look at the policy and research that's needed in this area. As we said, there's a demographic shift, both in globally, and how this impacts low, middle, high income countries and different regions. So, for example, when I did these regional seminars last year, we were talking to people like in Africa then we target people in the Middle East and East Asia. So some of the impacts of climate change, for example, one was like the glacier was melting, and because of that, some younger people were then building houses on the side of the mountain. The older people knew that they shouldn't be doing that, and eventually there was a landslide because of climate storms, and that knowledge, that local knowledge, is being eroded. But what I'm saying is that each region, although the impacts and the effects are in one way similar, it's also slightly different depending on the environment in which they live. So as the climate intensifies, the impact of climate change intensifies and that affects older people, we need to have a more understanding, a greater evidence base, and to ensure that policy, both at the local, national, international level, responds to the impact climate change will have on an aging population. So, in terms of framing the issue, as I said, where we are now, older people remain marginal in the climate discourse. That we have this kind of more silo approach to climate and aging, and policy needs to address these two aspects of climate and aging. You could get policy just on aging, or policy just on climate. I think it's starting to change. People are starting to policymakers start to understand and recognize when it comes to adaptation and how that impacts vulnerable groups such as older people. As I said, the other aspect is, and although I'm saying vulnerability, it's not all about vulnerability. It's all about the role older people can take in climate mitigation and how they can help understand this, how older people can help adapt to a changing climate. And the reason why I think there's a need for this is because, as I say, older people are neglected in some, are not considered in policy enough when it comes to climate. But we know that this will impact on how we respond to the climate change, on health and social systems, and in order to prepare and also to ensure that our response to climate is inclusive and intergenerational as well. So there's lots of reasons why. But the next question is, well, okay, we know there's an issue. We want to study this kind of intersection. How do or how should we study it? And one thing that I would like to propose today is this concept we've been looking at what we call the 3C framework. So as I said, normally we can see older people just being vulnerable to the climate impacts, but here it's trying to take a much more holistic approach and move beyond these deficit-only narratives. So we're looking at older people as contributors to the climate crisis, casualties of the climate crisis, but also change makers using their like local knowledge of environmental change, their kind of advocacy in climate action. So this approach, this framework, can provide a single lens to understand the complexity of older people as contributors, casualties, and change makers. So here I just want to go very quickly through what I mean when we talk about contributor, casualty, and change maker. So, and one aspect here is like older adults' emissions. These are shaped by life course consumption and what we call provisioning systems. So back in 2007, what I did was looked at household consumption by age in the UK then, and to look at, what were people spending their money on, what were they consuming, and how is that impacting their carbon footprint. And we found that those people at that time, probably the mid 50s, early baby boomers, had one of the largest carbon footprints compared to those people like 70 or 80. So you saw how their consumption changed. Transport was a big aspect of their carbon footprint in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. But when it came to become less mobile, then home energy was another aspect of their carbon footprint. But also, if you try and look at the carbon footprint of an aging population, at the moment there's different these different evidence. Some say that there is a decline in the carbon footprint as you get older. Others say not necessarily so. It really depends on the research that you're looking at. But also we can see that in the context of lower middle income countries, but also having access as well to certain things like a good public transport system or an housing, efficient housing. So, but also how our social care and our health system, the carbon footprint of that. So when we talk about the contributor, it's individual consumption, but it's also those what we call provisioning system, the health system, the transport system, that a social care system. What is the impact of those systems that support an aging population? So there's lots of research and understanding that's needed when it comes to the carbon age-related carbon footprint. The other aspect, which I think probably we all know very well, is the casualty, because we always hear about older people being vulnerable. And this is what I said earlier, the kind of intersection between the climate hazard, the exposure, and the susceptibility. And this is has the issues around equality and place. Um, to save time, I won't say anything about that, but really it's about understanding the impact of climate change on older people, but how do we respond, especially when in a disaster situation, and how do we ensure that we address, other issues, GEDC issues such as gender, disability, and ethnicity. So older people are always presented as vulnerable, but here in this model or framework, I'm trying to take a much more holistic approach. So the third part is the change maker. Older adults are agents of climate action. So we know that they have the experience, the wisdom. Like I say, in some of the regional webinars we held last year in developing countries, local people had good local knowledge of environmental change and was using that knowledge to support climate adaptation planning, also for preparedness and community leadership, traditional knowledge, and also building this connection between the different generations. So we have contributor, casualty, and changemaker as a potential framework for climate gerontology. So here, hopefully, I'll just do a quick summary to give you what we're proposing. So you have your climate forces and later life emissions. So you have your consumption, both throughout your life, but later life when it comes to housing, domestic energy use, diet, consumption, goods and services. We have the climate hazards, the extreme weather events, and we have environmental change. These are the forces that are affecting not just emissions, but our health and well-being in later life. Then we have the three C's of climate gerontology, the contribution we make to greenhouse gas emissions, the impact that climate change has on us, and how we deal with that, but also older people as participation, advocacy, and volunteering. So understanding this framework, then we can see how climate action. So, for example, when it comes to contributor, what we're trying to do from, I guess, a policy perspective is looking at how do we have this low carbon transition? How can we reduce the footprint of transport, of housing, of our social care or healthcare systems? When it comes to casualty, is how can we ensure adapt to climate change, to exposure to some of the such as heat or storms and social vulnerability? How do we ensure that older people reach later life with the resilience to be able to cope with any of some of these changes in the climate? And then the final part, the change maker, is looking at older people as adult participation in place-based climate action, this volunteerism, involving them in local initiatives and understanding that older people can have a role and more can be done to mobilize older people at the local level. So this provides just a potential conceptual framework for climate gerontology with this concept of contributor, casualty, and change maker at the center. And when it comes to a research agenda, it's really understanding the contributors like, well, how lifetime consumption patterns, infrastructure, healthcare, and socioeconomic conditions shape greenhouse gas emissions in later life. How do income, housing, mobility, and social systems influence emissions among older adults? And how do cohort differences alter carbon footprints? And you might think that's an easy question to ask, but when you start to look, you don't get a straightforward answer. And it's important for that because by understanding the impact that we have our carbon footprint, this can help support policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to have interventions to ensure we have a low carbon lifestyles and behaviors when it comes to consumption. The casualty part is understanding, how climate-related hazards affect health, well-being, and how this changes across diverse groups of older people. What is the most exposed or least able to adapt and why? How do inequalities compound risk in later life? By understanding this, we can also hopefully we'll have the evidence base to strengthen adaptation planning and emergency response to reflect age, place, and social vulnerability. And then finally, the change maker is how older adults participate, influence, and lead climate mitigation adaptation efforts. So, what roles can older people play in decision making, advocacy, and community resilience? What enables or constrains participation? And then inform models. This can inform models of inclusive governance and support rights-based approaches to climate action. So, this is really presenting the framework for the study of climate gerontology, but also presenting the kind of research agenda which will influence the policy and research, so providing that evidence base to policy to take the action that's needed to adapt and deal with climate change. So in terms of where do we go from here, what do we need to do? As I said, we need to build a field and community of practice, deepen our own interdisciplinary research on how aging and climate vulnerability intersect. There needs to be more institutional recognition, integrating older people in national adaptation planning, risk reduction strategies. For example, last year we had a webinar on London Climate Week on older people and climate action. And in the UK, there was one group, older people's group, who were actively involved in Bristol in developing the Bristol Climate Action Plan and ensuring that the voices of older people in that city were included in the plan. So recognizing that there's that older people exist as a cohort, but also may have different needs and opinions that need to be integrated in climate planning. And then move away from vulnerability or high emitters, making it more showing that older people can have a climate can contribute to climate action and not these negative kind of approaches with vulnerability. It's like older people being vulnerable to climate change. Then you have this issue for when it comes to the kind of gap between the intergenerational gap, older younger people thinking older people are the culprits and emitted all these carbons, and that's why we're in this state in the climate crisis. So addressing these kind of intergenerational issues, and then ultimately translating this evidence into ensuring age-friendly, climate-resilient communities. And that's something we know that the World Health Organization is promoting age-friendly cities and communities. And it's a project that we've been doing in the UK, how we integrate climate in the concept of age-friendly cities and how we can ensure that these age-friendly cities are not just inclusive, but resilient to future climate change. So, oops. So what does this all mean? Why are we doing this? I think from the policy aspect, I think by having this evidence base, which we need to understand and develop better, we can better adapt to climate change and understand the world constraints. We can link it to net zero strategies in age and policy. For example, how we deal with retrofitting homes, transport, and how we embed participation and the inclusion of the diverse opinions and views of older people in climate action planning. And I think the three C's it could be a tool for identifying those gaps and trade-offs in local and national climate plans. So if I have to define, which we have defined climate gerontology, and maybe we need to update this, we would define climate gerontology as the study of the intersection between climate change and the unique challenges and needs of older people exposed to extreme weather events. We see this as an emergent interdisciplinary field developed from the conversion of three factors: an increase in the number of people living into old age, the rise in the number of climate-related extreme weather events, and understanding of how a changing climate can influence the quality of life of older people. So in conclusion, to bring this all together, climate change, I think climate gerontology could be a new interdisciplinary area that can reframe aging in the 21st century. We know that climate change is already impacting the lives of many people. this 3C framework could be a way of capturing older people, adults as, as a more balanced way, not just vulnerable, but contributing to the problem, but also being a solution to the problem from climate action. And hopefully this approach and this will lead to greater understanding and the evidence base for more just mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to adapt and be more resilient and ensure inclusion, participation, and intergenerational equity. So the next step really is to start to consolidate the research base and policy agenda and see aging as something truly affected by climate change. So on that note, I'll stop and we can have a discussion, hopefully some questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Gary. A lot, I think, to
A lot to
consider,
get going.
a lot to digest and take
Yes, I know.
in.
I realize
But
that. But
no, but fascinating and timely and so important, I suppose, that we be discussing this, as you well highlighted throughout your presentation. So you've been getting some virtual applause. I hope you've been seeing those
okay, yeah, thank you.
joining.
Yeah.
So and also a lot of conversations that have been happening in the chat
Okay. Sorry.
as you were going through your presentation, more just affirming, I suppose, what you were sharing. So I think you have a lot of folks who are similarly aligned in their thinking and in their activisms. We have quite a bit of time for some conversation. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions that they would like to pose to Gary. Again, you can write your message in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and pose your query.
Mm.
Um,
I am aware that it was quite a lot to go through in a short time to present this case, but I'm happy to digest or repeat certain things or explain things a bit further. Like I say, we've done a number of projects which I haven't included. I just wanted to present the case for climate gerontology. And if you want to hear more about other projects I've been doing, I can do that as well. Thank you.
And I think, Gary, you bring a really interesting and perhaps unique perspective because you've had the opportunity to travel globally. It sounds like to be able
Yeah.
to receive feedback and provide instruction or guidance, I suppose, on these topics. I was wondering, how have you found, as you've been moving globally and sharing this information, have you noticed regional differences, I suppose, in how it's received or um, kind of the receptiveness, I suppose?
Yeah, I think so for example, a big part, say for in Africa is, social protection. So if, maybe if in our countries, if we're flooded, we may get support for our homes to rebuild ourselves. Well, say Africa, they don't always, in certain countries, they don't always have that. But then a positive thought was thing was that we were talking about there is that they do have payments for people who've suffered from impacts such as climate change to help them recover. But generally, in another presentation, I normally show the graph between where the climate impacts are happening globally, but also where the social protection system is quite low. And that's where you have the problem where, you have this impact and you can't recover because you don't have the economic or social support system to help you get through it. So that's one thing. Was a big thing in terms of the countries. The other aspect was how what was interesting is the different impacts of climate change. So obviously, I would ever thought about glacial melting and what that meant for agriculture. That was a thing, and I think it was that the Central Asia, or then heat, and but then also within the heat in the Middle East, the kind of the political dimension, in the Middle East. So there's so many different aspects that they bring into it. But I guess the and then in India we had like the more kind of the some initiatives with Help Aid International that are working with local people in adaptation or sharing knowledge. So there are positive initiatives where older people are being involved. But yes, there are differences, but there's similarities as well.
Mhm.
And that's what was interesting. And I still have to write up that work, but of all the webinars we did, but it was a very interesting thing to do. And part of that was to raise awareness of climate and aging, and but also to understand by talking to different older people organizations what they see, what they see the problems are in their region.
Thanks, Gary. Anyone care to put Gavin? Are you comfortable to unmute yourself and ask it? Perfect. Take it
Yeah,
away.
thanks. Yes, fascinating presentation and resonates with some work I've been reading recently in the sort of what I think they categorize as dark ecology.
Mm.
And
Dark ecology.
yeah, it's kind of the philosophy, it's the eco-philosophy stuff. And
Okay.
I don't suppose I haven't really got a question, more of a statement. It's for reading that, it really gets quite depressing because, I wonder what you think of these ideas in dark ecology because it kind of it talks about climate change in terms of one of the things, it's sticky. It's like we are part of it. It is part of us. What do they mean by sticky is that we can't create some kind of escape velocity to separate ourselves from it, to do anything about it. We're part of the problem, we're part of the system. Another point I think in the dark ecology literature is that we can't see climate change either. It's interobjective. It's like we don't see its processes, we see its effects. We see forest fires, we see smoke, we feel temperatures, but we don't actually ever experience the process, which is climate change, which we might say experience capitalism much more literally.
Hmm.
And the other thing that they say is that it's like it's so vast. It's like it doesn't end in time or space, right? It's like everything happening all the time, and it
Hmm.
blurs at all kinds of distances. So we can never really get a handle on it, even an image of it. It's kind of like all we see is a phased space in front of us. And so, that they find these dark ecologists. They're like, well, what do you do about that? And all they can say is really, well, you've got to realize your insignificance and your significance at the same time. That you can affect your
Hmm.
world, but you might not affect, or you may not ever experience a solution. Right? You've got to realize
Hmm.
you may never see this work out well. But all you can do is affect your own world. And they sort of talk about in terms of instead of having a utopian vision of a perfect world, have a utopian drive, right? Drive yourself forward in the right way, and that's very different than having some far off vision. Because that's difficult to motivate yourself with that vision.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is really interesting stuff, and but it doesn't give you a sense too much of a sense of overall hope.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something I've done also climate change communication projects, and this is something again, see how what's interesting to see how this debate has changed. So back in around 2007, 2008, I was looking at how can you reduce your carbon footprint. So we were working in the community, trying to recruit local households to understand their carbon footprint and to take action in their street to reduce their carbon footprint. So, like I go and knock on the door and say, "Good morning, good afternoon. Would you like to learn how to reduce your carbon footprint?" And after a while, people were not interested because it doesn't appeal to them. But then on a follow-up project, which we decided to, after a while, this kind of focus just on emissions gets a little bit, intense. Then we broadened it out, and we did another project called the Good Life Project, where then we were knocking under, do you want to have a good life? Do you want to improve? You make the most of your local community. And there we took a broader approach of understanding what the assets in your community, place-based assets in your community, how you can connect with your community to make it that kind of more resilient. So you've got that aspect. So being a more community-based, more vision for the community. But then equally, I understand when it comes to carbon footprint and behavior change that the certain things that we're powerless to do. So, for example, people would like to say recycle food waste, but there's no opportunity for the food. Or if you live in the countryside, you would like to do public transport, but you don't have access to a bus system. And that's where I mentioned in my slide the provisioning system. So it's really how, like you said, being positive, but how you can realize that you can do certain things, but there's other things that you need the provisioning system, the social care, the transport system, the healthcare, and how you can use your power and voice to change that. And yeah, it can be overwhelming, but I'm always trying to be optimistic. But I guess the immediate impact is how climate is impacting our lives. Whether it pours down with rain or your house gets flooded, that's immediate impact on what you're going to do about that, and how will that affect your health and well-being. So that's where I think some of this adaptation and resilience is needed. So yeah, it's
I think what I'm really hearing, Gary, is just how much climate change, I suppose, is imbricated into so many other systems that we live with, whether it's kind of politics or economics or kind of pleasure and play as well. So it's not, you can't just focus, I suppose, on it on its own. It is so interwoven with so many other systems in our everyday life. Um, um, I am going to just turn to the comment chat box now to turn to some of the questions that we have there. Trish is wondering, Gary, if you could share any water-related actions or stories.
no. I don't I don't sorry. Um I don't yeah, I don't have water related directly. I know again some of the work on Help Aid International are doing very good projects internationally. If you're interested internationally on older people and different when it comes to agriculture, I can't remember water one being done there. So sorry, but I could try and find out for you and send it to you, Nichols. But good question. Sorry, I can't answer it.
I've just popped the Help Age link into the chat if folks
Yeah, yeah.
maybe want to take a gander there. Um, let's see. I'm moving now to Aisha's comment here. They're wondering how the contributor dimension of the three C's should be
Yeah.
understood under structural inequality, particularly in the global South context, where older adults have contributed relatively minimally to climate change, and yet experience those impacts disproportionately.
Yeah, I think but this is what we were saying also, yeah, globally. I think the biggest thing for me is the evidence base is to understand what's going on. And like I say, it's a very simple, if you Google age-related carbon footprint, there's more research out there, like especially in China, but the messaging is not consistent. We've seen how older people, households are changing, their consumption are changing in countries such as China. But I guess it's the evidence base. In terms of what that means, that's becomes kind of more of a, I guess, a political, ethical kind of issue. How we address that is, yeah, is a broad, so even broader topic. So, from my perspective, it's like understanding the evidence base. Once we understand what's going on, then how can we influence that when it comes to policy? And maybe then we need to address some of the kind of inequities. And it's the same, like saying like Africa didn't contribute to global climate change from its emissions, but it's being impacted. It's the same kind of issue, and then it requires more global approach. It's a difficult, challenging question.
Hmm. Um, Ula, who's joining us from Austria. Hi, Ula. Is just
Right.
saying thank you so much for your presentation. And she's wondering if you have come across any instances of blatant ageism in your research, or perhaps in your workshops or in some of the policy work that you've been doing.
I guess, to be honest, no, not really. Not in my work because obviously it is working with older people. Um, but no, no, not at the moment, which is positive. But yeah. I mean, what I could do, if there's no more questions, I could just show you a few of the projects we've been working on. This one, if you would like. Is there any more questions?
Well, I wonder, Trish did have a question just about positive policy examples to share, and I'm wondering if what you were about to share might kind of nicely lead into answering that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of the work that we're doing. There are policy examples. Like I say, I've been working the last year more internationally. So if you look at the Help Age International website, they've got lots of case studies where they're working with people in Indian forestry. I think it's biochar is one thing where older people are actually taking a very positive role in that kind of climate adaptation and local environment. In terms of nationally, as I said, one of the positive things that we were doing in this climate action webinar at London Climate Week, we have a very active group in Bristol of older people assembly who's contributing and help develop the climate action plan for the city. So there are there positive aspects, and I mean, if you then go into all the volunteering that's done when it comes to environment, there's lots of I think there's lots of positive um, actions, and some of the groups like the Grey Green initiative as well. So yes, I think it's not there's lots of positive movement going on. Um, but I would like to share, if that's okay, a project that we're actually in the middle of doing now. Um, and this is something going, you could say it's positive, is what we call climate wisdom. And here we're looking at how to work with people living with dementia. So looking at dementia inclusive climate action, is we're working with the Meeting Centre Scotland, which has a number of meeting centres across the country where older people living with dementia meet with their carers. We're working with them to engage not just their older people living with dementia or people living with dementia and their carers, but also the community into climate action, and also to build that kind of knowledge and awareness, and also not just for mitigation but also adaptation. So raising awareness of how climate change impacts the local community and especially this group, but involving them in different activities. It's very participatory, so it's quite a unique approach we're taking. We're still learning how things work because, for example, each centre are really doing their own thing, but they're very engaged at the moment. So this has just started, and I'd be very happy to share once we move forward. And so I said the idea is really strengthening the resilience and reducing exclusion, building confidence, connection with a range of different activities. But the idea from this project, which will be to develop like toolkit and training materials that can be replicated, not just within Scotland, across the UK, and more globally through this meeting centre network. So I think this is probably a positive story, hopefully. I say we're at the beginning, we're getting good engagement, and I think it's good to the idea is like using these hubs for where people meet living with dementia as a way of entering the community, including them in climate action, but also raising awareness when it comes to climate adaptation and building local resilience. So that's one on climate wisdom. And the other one that we completed was looking at healthy aging in a changing climate. I don't know, Nicole, how much time have we got? Because maybe I could just show a short video of the results of that. That'd be the nice thing to end on.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, we still have
I don't,
10, just
the
under
only
10
issue is
minutes.
whether the volume works, because I know last time. Do you want to? Can you hear that? Can you hear anything?
Unfortunately,
No,
no.
there's something I have to do. I can't remember, but I will. That's a pity.
If you stop sharing and then once you share, you just have to select share with sound. There should be a little um um
Share settings.
when
Okay.
you yeah, when you click on your PowerPoint kind of
Oh
screen
yeah,
on
share
share, there should
sound.
be
Yeah, I've
share
got it.
sound. Okay.
Okay. So hopefully I can. This you'll find this interesting. Well, so just very quickly, so this is a project we were doing looking at healthy aging and a changing climate. So I don't know if you're aware, there's the World Health Organization concept of age-friendly cities and communities that look at all the different aspects, like what we were talking earlier, that contribute to aging, transport, housing, social participation, communication, community support, and health, outdoor spaces. So these all by working across these different areas, it helps to prevent age, helps to create age-friendly cities and communities. But one aspect that's missing from this kind of concept is this notion of climate change, the impact climate change will have on some of these categories, and how you build resilience. And that's what we tried to do in the UK, looking at we explored how age-friendly cities and communities can build climate resilient supports and enable healthy aging. But we were particularly looking at what were the perceived barriers and opportunities, and how do we co-design solutions. So we actually had workshops in the nations of the UK, Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. I say we looked at policy and practice, community dialogue events, and the most important thing was like the co-design workshops. And we were trying to ask what climate change means to all the people that were involved in this project, what impacts extreme weather events have on their community, and what exists and what the community can do to respond to extreme weather. Sorry, this is a and so, on the basis of this 1 year project and co-designing the kind of solutions with older people, this is what we did look. We looked at promoting. They've recommended promoting age-friendly community hubs, future-proofing life homes, great fostering greater intergeneral collaboration, and co-designing interventions, but having a much more integrated approach. And it looked at these different aspects. But we did this film, which hopefully you can hear the volume, which summarizes the recommendations. So let's see if it works now. Can you hear the sound? Yeah. Okay. Great. So hopefully that was a great project to do where we, like say, co-design the solutions on the basis of that project, which you can read the report. We then developed the Climate Wisdom Project for more inclusion of people living with dementia. So, in conclusion, so when we talk about climate gerontology, being an interdisciplinary researcher, as you can see, it covers so many different areas. But I guess it's how it all connects, how it one impacts the other, how we can understand that. And from a research perspective, it's about having that understanding, doing that research, which can provide the evidence base to then feed into policy to have those correct policies that include the voice of older people in adaptation and mitigation and create age-friendly, inclusive, and climate-resilient communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. I will, before I let you go and let everyone else go, Laurel just wrote quite an intriguing comment in the chat. So Laurel is 83 years young. Um, oh, thanks, Ula. See you later. And so uh, speaking about how I suppose communication from so many different government level is increasingly online, only accessible digitally, and thinking about how a lot of climate change elements, whether in emergencies or planning, communication is key, but it's happening online. And so, what do we do for those individuals, whether lack of infrastructure or age or other abilities, for example, aren't able to be online or download the newest app, for example. So, how can we be thinking about communication that's accessible for all?
And
Hopefully I've
this
captured
is
that, Laurel.
and this question was brought up in our workshops with older people about this digital exclusion, that not everybody can do that. And I guess some of the things like these community hubs, which we were suggesting, like and what we're trying to do in the meeting centre Scotland, these community hubs is one way of meeting as a community when people meet to share that kind of information in those kind of communities, doing it that way, but also understanding where, if you're a local authority, municipality, understanding where older people are, what they need for emergency preparedness as well. So it's about the information. Then how do people who are not connected to the internet, where do they get their information from? And then how to reach them. So there's definitely something that needs to be addressed, and it was an issue. And I can see that happening through community, but also understanding if to where older people live in the community to support them to get that message out. So it's a really important point.
Can I just say something?
Please
Because
do.
one of the things
Yeah.
in my experience as being a senior is
Hmm.
social isolation, and we continue to
Yeah.
see that all the time. Whether
Yeah.
it's with Alzheimer's, whether it's with
Hmm.
dementia, any of those things, social isolation is becoming a huge problem. And how do we combat that? Along with the communication that changes so fast
Yeah. Yeah.
that it's really difficult to keep up with that. So that's an underlying issue, I think.
Yeah. And I say it's not something new to me. I've heard this before, and
Mhm.
in terms of solution, I guess it all depends on,
Well,
the local context. But I see as a possible one way is this kind of these community. So we have, for example, we have warm spaces, the idea of warm spaces in the UK. So if it's two people meet, or now we were talking about these cool spaces. If it's cold, these and this project that we're doing on climate wisdom, and these meeting centres is like using these community hubs as a way to address not just loneliness, but raise awareness and get the message out there about these things. But it's just one, not the solution, but one solution that might be appropriate for where you live. It's a very bottom-up approach, but absolutely the
well,
issues are there. I agree. I agree with you.
yeah,
So
and I get it. I mean, in Burlington, Ontario, where I
yeah,
live, we are trying at this point to feed everybody and to make sure that people at night are in from the cold,
yeah,
and
yeah.
to combat the isolation and get the word out there. It's going to be building a community in a very special way that we haven't come to grips with yet.
Mm.
Mhm. And but they also say, like, when I said the kind of the other C, the change maker, that a lot of older people who do volunteering, who volunteer, who contribute to this, is also the benefit. The co-benefit is that you have a community, you're not isolated, and we have a whole discussion around that area about how to make that more accessible for older people, that volunteerism and the ageism that might exist when it comes to climate change, because it's always seen as a younger person's issue kind of thing. So I've just there's so
I'm
many
skeptical.
aspects to this that you can look at, and that's why we need a new discipline for everybody to beaver away, looking at the different aspects, but
Mm.
more importantly, bringing it together to have that holistic approach. That's my my opinion.
I wish you well.
Thank you.
And I'm just mindful of time here. So I want to say another gigantic thank you so much to Dr. Hack for joining us and for sharing so much information about the work that you've been undertaking for almost 2 decades here. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And thanks to everyone here who joined us for another um, rousing episode of the Gilbrea Seminar Series. This will be available on the Gilbrea YouTube channel. And stay tuned in March for our next and final Gilbrea seminar series, which will be in person and more news about that to come. Take good care, everyone, and thank you again.
Thank you.